Hey students, welcome to week 6. We are going to begin our poetry unit. So for the next few weeks we are going to spend a lot of time reading poetry, discussing poetry, a lot like what we did with our short story unit. Good job on getting through short story. I think right there at the end a lot of you were really starting to grasp how we deeply read short story and how we try to connect every piece of a story to a larger meaning. And if you just started to get the grasp of all of that, A, kiss your brain, but B, also realize that we are going to take those skills and move on to poetry. And so none of that will sort of be lost on you, right? Now we're just taking it and we're applying it to a different genre of literature. For this week, you are going to read one chapter in your textbook, which is called How Do I Read Poetry, which can be really informative. I'm going to go over some techniques on how to actually read that. And then there are 6 poems I want you to read, and they cover a variety of time span. Most of the poetry we are going to read in this class is going to be more contemporary or postmodern poetry, but I do want to touch on a couple of the classics. I think it's good to know, first of all, some of the iconic and canonized pieces of literature, because certainly lots of things in today's world connect back to these pieces of literature. So don't be overrun by the old world language or maybe the old world style. We're not going to spend too much time on some of the really old stuff. We'll be spending more time on the contemporary stuff. So make sure you take your quiz by Wednesday and you post your original discussion board by Thursday, and then you'll have 2 responses due by Saturday. So this should feel very much like, again, what we did in the last, or the first 4 weeks rather. Okay, let's get started talking about poetry. In short story, we had what was often called a character, or sometimes we had a first-person narrator telling the story. In poetry, we have what's called a persona or a speaker. Either of those words are appropriate. It is not the poet that we refer to as the speaker. Writers are artists, and it's not necessarily their voice that they are using. A lot of poets will craft a persona or a character who says those things. So be sure you're very careful of not saying the poet when you mean to say the speaker or the persona. In poetry, or excuse me, in short story, a lot of our stories have a dramatic arc to them. There is generally an inciting incident and rising action, climax, right? There seems to be a very structured way to write a short story. In poetry, that's not necessarily true. We have 2 main forms of poetry that we're, not forms, but different styles of poetry that we're going to look at. One is called narrative, and simply narrative, just as in short story, that means that the poem is actually telling a story. Or sometimes it could be a lyrical poem. And lyrical, if you just think of lyrics, right, song lyrics, sometimes these are just images that stack up on each other. There are all kinds of forms in poetry. We will be looking at several different forms. One form you'll look at this week is with Shakespeare's My Mistress's Eyes Are Nothing Like the Sun, and that's in the form of a sonnet. And form simply just means that a particular structure for a poem, and there's all kinds of different forms out there. We will, like I said, we'll touch on a few of them, but we certainly do not have time to cover all the different types of forms out there. Point of view, we still consider point of view in poetry. It is a speaker or a persona that's often telling the information or telling the story, depending on, again, what kind of a poem it is. We still want to consider tone. What is being said? What do the images mean? What kind of emotion are connected with words? You certainly want to consider connotation and denotation. You'll pay attention to details. Certainly imagery is going to play an enormous role in poetry. And that's where I think sometimes a lot of students can get frustrated with poetry, is they want to be able to read it one time and decide that, hey, this is what the poem means. And that's not really how poetry works. Poetry is actually the most precise form of language that we have, believe it or not. And what makes it so magical is that in a small amount of space, you can get a precise, complex feeling about something, or an idea about something. So poets spend years playing with language, playing with line breaks, playing with punctuation. Short stories are compressed and everything means something, but that is even more true in poetry because most of these poems are very, very small. There is nothing that is on accident. Everything is going to have meaning. The way that lines are structured, how many syllables, right? Rhyme, certainly, rhythm. All of those things play a key role, and these are all things that poets are aware of. It was not an accident that these poems ended up canonized in a book like this. So don't be overwhelmed if you feel like you are reading some of these things and you're not really picking up, well, what does this mean and what does that mean? Just pick up what you can for right now, right? If you find a line and you think, wow, that sounds a little weird, that makes me feel like that might be sad or aggressive, it might be, and go back and look and see if there are other things in a poem that might continue to support that feeling that you might have, right? That's what poetry asks us really to do, is to sit down and comb over what exactly is the poet getting at here, and why would they say it in this way? Okay? So, how to read poetry. Get the literal meaning first. This is really important. So there are a lot of these poems, they're going to take you 10 seconds to read. So what I expect you to do is to read it multiple times, right? And the first couple of times, just read it to get the meaning. What's actually kind of happening? Again, you'll want to consider your persona, who is speaking. And you might not know a name, you might not know a gender, you might not know how old or what their job is, right? It's a lot more, or it can be a lot more vague depending on the poem that you're reading. But you should have a sense of who is speaking in terms of maybe their relationship or where they are in the world, right? What kind of a person that they might be. It might be, all of humanity sort of speaking in a poem. So just try to get that literal meaning. Who is that speaker first? I personally would read a lot of these poems aloud, as silly as that sounds. Poetry is meant to be read aloud. And again, poets are incredibly conscious about rhyme and rhythm. And the only way for us to accurately hear a lot of those things is to slow down and hear that being read aloud. So if you can, read the poem aloud. And if you don't have if you can't do that, another suggestion that I have for you is try to maybe find some YouTube videos. Sometimes you can find poets reading their own poems. And that's much better than even you reading it, right? If you can hear it in their own voices, you can hear the cadence of their voice. You can hear where they put emphasis, where they pause, right? That's also helpful sometimes in determining what a poem means. I would advise you, though, to be careful, especially when it comes to a lot of these poems. There's a lot of projects out there on YouTube with poetry in particular, and what I mean by that is there are a lot of it seems like high school English teachers who assign these poems, and then students make videos or of themselves reading the poems. So I'd be careful of that kind of stuff, only because you can get, I think, easily kind of lulled into believing what that student wants you to think or feel or something like that. So what we really want to do when we are reading poetry is try to come to or arrive at how we feel the poem, what the poem is trying to say. And the only way to really do that is to read the poem again and again and again and start to connect the pieces a little bit. So make sure you do read slowly. I reread things again and again. A lot of times I'll read through the poem all the way through, and then I'll go back and read and reread lines and start to ask myself, well, what does this mean and why does that mean that? I certainly strongly recommend reading with a pencil in hand, right, to ask those questions in the margins. I define everything so that I don't know. So I don't just mean like, an esoteric word that it seems unclear. I certainly do that as well. I'll write the definition right there in my book. But what I also mean is if there is a proper noun that you're not sure what it is, I would Google that too. Sometimes there might be another reference to something in there, and you think, well, I don't know why that's capitalized. Google it, see what you find out, right? So what you want to be able to do is take each individual line, each individual word, and be able to connect it back to meaning. And so constantly be asking yourself those questions, and make those associations with meaning. One thing that I would caution you away from is that almost all of the poems that I'm going to assign you over the next couple weeks of reading, you can find lots of information on those poems. But that's not really the point here. Even though I'm going to be asking you things like, well, what does that poem mean? And how did you arrive at that meaning? What I don't want you to do is just go and Google that and go to websites that tell you exactly what that poem means and how to think about that poem. The point of this class is to develop critical thinking skills, critical analysis, and be able to provide evidence based on how you arrived at that. And so if you don't, in week 1, start practicing those skills, right, you're going to lose the ability to ultimately arrive at those answers. So please, please, please try to refrain from that. If you know, I guess what I was going to say is if you feel the need to, you know, go on SparksNotes and to find all the answers you can to the poem, because you are really struggling with that, I would much rather you just send me an email or to stop by my office or to give me a call and to say, hey, Vicki, can we talk about this poem? Because it really doesn't do you any good in terms of developing the skills that you need to be successful in this class, just to find the answers. If that were the case, y'all, I would just tell you, well, just read what somebody else said and then make that your own idea. But that's really not what we're dealing with here. So try to refrain from that. Also, the discussion board should help you out too. So persona. The persona or the speaker is the character the poet created to speak through. So I already mentioned that. It's not the poet. So make sure you are using those words, persona or speaker. Either or is fine. It just depends on its personal preference. You'll hear me use both. So again, you're going to want to ask who is speaking in the poem, and then how would you describe that persona? So based on everything you know about what that speaker is saying, who might that person be? And again, it might not necessarily be very concrete. You might say something like, oh, well, it's clearly a, you know, son talking about a father, or, you know, the persona might be a dog. That does happen, right? So again, just kind of wade through that. And those should be some of the first questions that you ask as you approach each of these poems. In terms of tone, so you'll want to ask, again, what is the speaker's tone? And which words reveal this tone? And there might be multiple tones that a speaker has toward the subject matter. In fact, I would say that that's probably true for many poems. Many poems are dealing with complex issues of relationships, or war, or love, or lust, or there's all kinds of topics out there, and they're not very black and white. And so you might want to say to yourself, okay, well, what does the tone of this thing mean? And, you know, depending on, you know, how much you like to write in your books, some of you might actually be turning them back in, so I understand if you don't, but you might want to take notes in terms of categorizing your tones. If you come up with 2 different tones, maybe jot down those words that reveal tone A and words that reveal tone B. Right? Also consider irony too. Sometimes poets are trying to use speakers in an ironic kind of a way, so they don't necessarily mean everything that they say. But again, tone is one of those things you should be able to put your finger on, right? Speaker, tone. We're going to look at a poem right now. I'm going to hit play and see if this works. Okay.
Make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death. Such waltzing was not easy. We romped until the pans slid from the kitchen shelf. My mother's countenance could not unfrown itself. The hand that held my wrist was battered on one knuckle. At every step you missed, my right ear scraped a buckle. You beat time on my head with a palm caked hard by dirt, then waltzed me off to bed, still clinging to your shirt.
Sorry about the little hiccup there. But My Papa's Waltz by Theodore Roethke is an incredibly famous poem, and that was actually video of the poet reading his poem. And I stopped short of showing you the whole video because right there at the end, whoever posted that video actually has their own interpretation of how they feel this poem means. And what's really great about this poem is there are two kinds of ways that you can see this poem. And so I'll explain that in just a second, but something that I want to point out initially, right? So I always look at titles to help me out here. My Papa's Waltz. And a waltz is a dance. It's also a type of music. I am somewhat familiar with music, but I think a waltz typically goes 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, right? So with that in mind, listening to Theodore Roethke read his own poem, he did have a very sort of waltzy kind of cadence to the poem itself. The whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death. Such waltzing wasn't not easy. You'll notice right there, too, we have some rhyme happening. And again, if I was explicating this poem, I would note those things. We have breath and death, we have dizzy, and we have easy. If I look down here in stanza 2, we have pans, countenance, which is a weird one. We have shelf and itself. We also have wrist and mist, knuckle, buckle, head, bed, dirt, and shirt. Also notice here we have 4 stanzas. So in fiction we have paragraphs to help us group information. In poetry we have what are called stanzas. So that just simply means a group of lines. So we have the first stanza here. I do want to take this second to point out that not all poetry rhymes. In fact, most contemporary poetry does not rhyme. And there is a lot of rhyming poetry out there, but certainly that's not a requirement of poetry. It doesn't have to rhyme, but this poem does. And I also notice here that I have 4 lines in each stanza. So we have a total of 16 lines in 4 stanzas. So I asked myself initially, who is the speaker? It definitely seems like a small boy, right? Those first 2 lines, the whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy. But I hung on like death, such waltzing was not easy. So I'm going to take a guess. This your is an adult, right? Who sounds like is drinking a lot of whiskey, right? And if that breath is so heavy with alcohol, it could make someone else dizzy, right? That's someone who is very, very intoxicated. This persona is speaking from the first person here, but I hung on like death. And so if it is a small boy, right, he would have to kind of hang on. But again, I notice these things, right? Is it past tense? Which it is, right? I hung on like death is past tense. So perhaps it's an adult looking back at his childhood. Okay. Is the adult speaker looking back with a different perspective than he might have had as a child? I'm going to save that question for just a second later. I feel like that's a little bit more complicated. What is the speaker's attitude of the father? So again, this is where I'm trying to figure out tone of this particular poem. And I would notice not only what is literally going on, the whiskey itself, right? The dancing that's happening. Look at stanza 2. They are dancing so hard that the pans are falling from the shelf, right? And the mother's countenance, and if you don't know what that word is, you should definitely look it up. But smile, right, could not unfrown itself, right? So mom doesn't seem happy right there. The hand that held the speaker's wrist, right, is battered on one knuckle. So this hand seems to be hurt in some way, definitely seems to be a little harder here. At every step you missed, my right ear scraped a buckle. So again, literally what's happening, it sounds like, the small boy and the father are dancing, and the father sort of misses a step, perhaps because he's inebriated, and the small boy, right, whose head would be right about maybe the father's waist, is scraping on the buckle of the belt when this happens, right? Look at fourth stanza here. You beat time on my head. So to beat time sometimes literally means like tapping your fingers, right? Drumming them on the steering wheel, or just like I did right now, tapping them on my desk. And so time is getting beat in on the small boy's head. Now that could be just sort of playful. I certainly tap on my kids' heads. But this particular time is being beat on the kid's head with the palm caked hard by dirt. So this is a working man, a working class man. And then the young boy is waltzed off to bed, still clinging to the father's shirt. Okay. So again, I'm looking for a tone here. What are those words that sort of say that? And when I see something like hung on, oh, sorry, I don't know why that did that. Hung on like death, that to me doesn't sound like fun. If you're hanging on like death, you think that there's something wrong. That's not a playful kind of a way, right, to engage with someone. When the child's ear is being scraped by a buckle, it doesn't sound like a kind of playful thing. It definitely sounds more violent, right? That the father is dancing so wildly that the young boy's ear is being scraped, right? Same thing with, oops, just kidding, go back. Same thing with time being beat on his head, right? It's not that the father is tapping, the word is beat. That word can mean corporeal punishment, right? So a spanking, think of that. So what we have here is really kind of complex, because a lot of times you can approach this poem and say, oh, this is very playful. They're dancing together, which parents sometimes do with their young children, right? And they're having so much fun that they're knocking pans off the shelf. And oh, sure, the father is drunk a little bit, right? But the boy likes it because the last two lines say that even though he was waltzed off to bed, he's still clinging to the father, right? He still enjoys what's going on. However, if you sort of look at these things regarding tone and the speaker's attitude towards the father, it seems more complex than that. And this is perhaps why I asked this question up here. Is the adult speaker looking back with a different perspective than he might have had as a child? Sometimes children aren't fully aware of what is going on. As a child, the persona might not have known that the father was drunk, that the father was so sloppily drunk that he was actually hurting his child, or that he was, endangering him in some kind of way, right? So as a child, he might have actually really enjoyed this moment, or found it fun or endearing, if you will. But as an adult, you can look back and see that very differently. And so what this poem does is a really great job of navigating through that complex relationship. The feeling of a young boy who's clinging to his father, but also as an adult sort of looking back at that from a different perspective. And again, this is why poetry is complex. It's not nice and neat. There isn't just sort of one way to look at this. It can be both things, and there's nothing wrong with that. Okay, so denotation versus connotation. Denotation, just think of dictionary definition. As a reader of poetry, and hopefully a lover of poetry one day, you should be able to understand that language works on many levels. So you always want to look at the dictionary definitions of things, especially when you don't know them. Or when you hit a line in a poem that feels a little awkward or funky, right? Look up the definition, because you never know when a definition is the one maybe you're not familiar with, right? Maybe it's a secondary definition that is maybe more obscure or isn't used quite as much. You also want to consider the connotation of a word as well. So this is the emotional or the associative second meaning of a word. And these are not available in a dictionary. These are sometimes just the things that kind of come with knowing a word. So for instance, when I was talking about beat time on my head from my Papa's Waltz, the word beat absolutely means a unit of measure in music. But it also can mean to beat someone, right? To hit them, to be violent against them, right? And so I'm looking at all of those things. Beat works well with the sort of musical aspect of my Papa's Waltz. However, it also works with this idea of the father being violent in some kind of way, whether, purposeful or not, right? Look at the definition of father, right? Certainly it can mean, or I guess I should have put up the word papa, right? Every family is certainly different, but for you, right, just depending on how you define that, the role of a father can be somewhat negative, it can be positive, right? And it kind of depends on how you bring that, your own personal emotional baggage to those words too. So pay attention for those things. Simile and metaphor, I think I covered this before, but similes are comparisons using the words like or as. So the moon was like a bowl of sour milk. That's a comparison between the moon and a bowl of sour milk. A metaphor is a direct comparison. And so it doesn't use a word like or as. The moon is a bowl of sour milk. So that's a direct comparison right there. Metaphors are usually stronger than similes, but they both can be incredibly effective forms of figurative language. Oh, I did have that one up there. So that's a simile. The moon was like a bowl of sour milk. Personification is when we give human qualities to non-human things. So again, watch out for that kind of stuff. Certainly it appears all over poetry. If you see something like, oh, the rain or the sky cried today, right? That's personification because the sky isn't human and the sky can't cry. But that might be a really lovely way to say something. And that personification in that particular example would show us an emotion of sadness, right? We often cry as humans when we're sad. And if the sky was crying, maybe as an artist, I'm trying to evoke that sort of sense of sadness. So that's how you kind of want to connect figurative language right there. This is a line from a poem, "The afternoon, the evening sleeps so peacefully." Certainly the afternoon and the evening don't sleep. Again, they're not human. But in this imagery, it does sound peaceful, but it also sounds like nothing is really happening, right? That everything is kind of calm in nature, right? If the afternoon and the evening are asleep, what is the rest of the world doing? Rhyme and rhythm. So rhyme just simply means repeating similar sounds, and an effective scheme produces rhyme. So again, just to point back to my Papa's Waltz, wrist, miss, knuckle, buckle. That's all that rhyme means. There are different kinds of rhymes, and we'll break those down in a week or two, right? There are exact rhymes, there are slant rhymes, there's different kinds of ways to rhyme. But for right now, just pay attention to rhymes. And they don't always have to be at the end of a line either. Rhymes can be in the middle of a line. Sometimes they can be words that are nearby each other that just sound like they are connected in some way. Again, everything has purpose in rhyming. Rhythm, so this is when we stress or we accent words and syllables. Usually it produces a kind of pattern, and that's what we hear as rhythm. So we romped until the pan slid from the kitchen shelf, then waltzed me off to bed, still clinging to your shirt, right? So these kinds of lines have a rhythm to them, and they're supposed to feel very dancey, which is the point of the poem, right? It's the poet has crafted this group of words and language to evoke not only that sense of dancing and emotional connection that a child has to a father, but maybe also as an adult looking back to see maybe how different that or disturbing maybe that situation is a little bit. And so rhyme and rhythm will help a poem. Okay, so that's poetry right there. Let me take you back to the discussion board. Oh, sorry. One thing that I do want to show you here is, I know I've showed you this website a lot, but there are particular ways that we talk about poetry. And I want to show you this right here, right now, because you are going to be talking about poetry in your discussion boards. And so it's important that you know how to actually quote this stuff. So we have to make sure that we do a couple of things, right? If we are pulling just a little piece of a line from a poem, right? So what MLA is, or excuse me, what Purdue is calling short quotations, right? We can certainly just put quotations around that, right? You could certainly put the poet's name, right, and the page number, which is fine. However, more often than not, we end up quoting a couple lines at a time. And so when you see the slash, that means the line break. So that means where in the poem, the way the poet has written it, that is where the line ends. And notice that in poetry, there are not often periods at the ends of lines. And so sometimes you're going to need to quote more than one line here. So if you'll notice this particular quotation, and then we get this 11 through 12, what that means is these are the line numbers of the poem. So if you flip to, let's say, page 488 in your book, and you're about to read My Mistress's Eyes Are Nothing Like the Sun, if I told you line 10, your book already has that line written out for you in terms of the line numbers. So you can look right away. They always do it 5, 10s, 15s, 20s, and so on. And that way you can figure out the line numbers that you need to quote. This is probably the way that most of us are going to end up quoting poetry, and that's the way that I want you to practice this particular week, right? So again, right, oh look, they quoted My Papa's Waltz here. Let's see, I was going to see if they did some line break ones. No, that's okay. But use this page as a guide, as a reference here when you do need help. So last thing I want to show you here is just the discussion board, just so that we are all clear on what is being asked of you this week. So you are going to read all 6 poems. So you are doing more reading than just 2. But in this discussion board, you're only writing about 2 particular poems. Part of the reason for this is we just don't have the time and space for everyone to talk about 6 poems. But I want you to be able to sort of dive deeply into 2 particular poems and then maybe respond to your classmates who read the other poems. So that way you could sort of get practice with talking about all 6 of them here. So you personally have to post an original discussion board. It has to be 300 words total minimum. That's for both poems, okay? For both poems. And discuss what you think each poem might be about. And why do you think that? And provide the evidence from the poem, so that's the quoted lines, right, to support your answers. So you might talk about tone. You might talk about certain words, multiple meanings, right, denotations, right, or connotations. You might talk about the persona of the speaker, right? What is that? Who is that person? You might even consider the biography of the poet and or when it was written. Certainly with William Butler Yeats, I believe The Second Coming was written during World War I. And so this it's a time when the Western world was really facing a lot of death and destruction, and absolutely that informed some of what William Butler Yeats was feeling when he wrote that poem. So you might want to consider those kinds of things too, right? Certainly all of that is on the table. So I am not looking for you to be right, okay? So those of you out there who are really stressed about like, oh my gosh, what if I don't find the exact meaning of every single line or that poem? That is not what we're trying to do in the first few weeks here, right? We're trying to work on these evaluative skills. So what I want you to do is concentrate on your critical thinking skills, your reasoning skills. Read those poems, reread those poems, listen to audio of those poems, go back and reread them again, read them to your children at night. It can be fun, right? Take a couple of days to kind of process them and connect those words and really dissect each line, each sound, all of that kind of stuff, and then come up with your answer of what you think each poem is about. I promise that will be a great way into each one. I also strongly suggest too, those of you who do a lot of driving, I know I have a lot of parents in this particular class who drive to and from school, right, dropping kids off, baseball games, just like myself. Listen to music that's poetic. One song that I really like, that I just find so much joy in actually teaching, if this was a face-to-face class and we had a lot more time, y'all, we would actually look at this song. But maybe if you have a chance, right, just listen to some music and try to figure out what does that metaphor or line mean. But Hosier's Take Me to Church is an incredibly poetic song, and it stacks up metaphor upon metaphor, and it really leaves the reader with, or excuse me, the listener with trying to figure out, wait, what is he talking about? If the church represents something negative, why is the speaker then saying, take me there? And so unpacking that really gets you to a very interesting place when you listen to that song. So anyways, my whole spiel here is just to really just try to flex those critical thinking skills. Of course, I want you to respond to 2 classmates by Saturday evening. And so you can certainly ask them questions or, offer them sort of alternative analyses, right, of the poems. But try, if you can, to select classmates who haven't already had responses yet. I feel like the first, 10 of you who end up posting your discussion board get tons of feedback, and then the last 5 of you don't get a lot of feedback. So let's try to spread it around a little bit more this week. If you have trouble, if you have questions, there's something you deeply need to discuss ASAP, please make sure you email me directly. I will start grading those short story essays. Probably I won't start diving into those until Monday. I have about, 50 other essays right now I'm trying to get through today and tomorrow from other classes before I start responding to yours. But that said, you will get those back in the next couple of weeks before your next poetry assignment, your final poetry assignment is due before we move on to the next genre here. So good luck, and I hope to talk to you guys soon. Bye.